The Eastern Front of World War II was the deadliest theater of the entire conflict, and it was especially catastrophic for prisoners of war. Both Germany and the Soviet Union operated under ideologies that dehumanized enemy soldiers, and neither side showed consistent regard for international laws governing the treatment of POWs. The numbers are horrifying. Out of approximately 5.7 million Soviet troops taken prisoner by the Germans, around 3.3 million did not survive captivity. That's a mortality rate of nearly 57%. Many Soviet soldiers were captured during large encirclement operations in 1941, especially during Operation Barbarossa, when German forces advanced rapidly into Soviet territory. Prisoners were routinely transported in overcrowded boxcars without food or water and forced to perform hard labor in dangerous conditions. Some were transferred to concentration camps, where survival rates were even lower. The Wehrmacht was not prepared to handle such large numbers of prisoners and had no logistical capacity or intention to care for them. Soviet POWs were confined in open-air camps without shelter, food, or medical care, particularly during the first winter of the war. Thousands were lost to exposure, untreated wounds, and malnutrition within weeks of capture. Beyond neglect, many Soviet POWs were deliberately targeted for harsh treatment. Nazi ideology framed Soviet soldiers, especially those identified as Jews or partisans, as enemies of the state rather than lawful combatants. The Commissar order issued that the German High Command instructed troops to execute Soviet political officers on sight. On the Soviet side, captured German soldiers also faced severe conditions. Out of an estimated 3 million German POWs taken by the Soviets, over 1 million lost their lives in captivity. German soldiers were often marched long distances in freezing weather with minimal supplies, and those unable to keep up were not always afforded protection. Camps in Siberia and other remote areas lacked sufficient food, heating, and medical attention. Survivors often spent years in captivity, with many not released until the mid-50s. Both sides engaged in reprisals and systemic indifference to the basic needs of captured soldiers. Thousands of miles away from the Eastern Front, in the Pacific, an entirely different system of captivity took place, one where surrender itself was viewed as a disgrace, and prisoners were treated accordingly. Allied prisoners of war held by Imperial Japan faced some of the most challenging conditions recorded in modern military history. Unlike in Europe, where at least some POW protections were nominally observed, Japan had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners. As a result, those captured, primarily Americans, British, Dutch, and Australians, were not afforded the legal safeguards recognized by most other major powers. An estimated 140,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner by Japanese forces. Of those, approximately 35,000 lost their lives in captivity, a mortality rate of about 25%. The causes varied. Insufficient food, untreated illness, extreme climate exposure, and physically demanding labor all contributed. But many camps were also sites of forced marches, physical punishment, and highly restricted communication with the outside world. One of the most infamous events was the Bataan Death March in 1942. After the fall of the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, around 76,000 American and Filipino troops were forced to march over 60 miles in extreme heat with little to no food or water. Thousands did not survive the journey. Survivors were sent to overcrowded camps where the conditions remained harsh. In Burma and Thailand, POWs were used to build the Burma-Thailand Railway, later known as the Death Railway. Rough terrain, disease-carrying insects, poor sanitation, and the near-total absence of medical care led to very high casualty rates among laborers. Prisoners who were injured or unable to work were not consistently provided alternative care, and in some documented cases were removed from work details with no further record. Japanese military culture at the time viewed surrender as dishonorable, and this belief strongly influenced how POWs were treated. Captives were often considered to have forfeited their rights as soldiers by surrendering, and this perception shaped daily interactions within the camps. After the war, several high-ranking officers were tried for mistreatment of prisoners, and many survivors provided detailed testimony. Their accounts, along with the recorded death rates and forced labor programs, make the Pacific Theater one of the most dangerous places to be captured during a war. The American Civil War saw a rapid capture of tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, but the infrastructure to house and care for these prisoners didn't keep pace. As a result, some of the most infamous prisoner of war camps in U.S. history were born, none more notorious than Andersonville in Georgia and Elmira in New York. Andersonville, officially named Camp Sumter, was established by the Confederacy in early 1864. Intended to hold about 10,000 men, it swelled to over 30,000 within months. Overcrowding led to a breakdown in basic sanitation, and the single creek running through the camp, meant to serve as both water source and latrine, became dangerously polluted. The prisoners lived in open-air conditions, exposed to the elements without proper shelter, clothing, or medical attention. Malnutrition was widespread, with cornbread and meager portions of beans being the typical rations. Disease spread rapidly, and over 13,000 Union soldiers lost their lives in just 14 months, a mortality rate of nearly 29%. On the Union side, Elmira Prison in upstate New York earned the nickname Hellmira from the Confederate inmates. Originally built as a training camp, it was converted into a prison in 1864 and struggled with many of the same issues: overcrowding, harsh winters, poor nutrition, and inadequate medical support. Prisoners suffered from scurvy, pneumonia, and dysentery. Many lacked sufficient clothing or blankets to survive the cold. Of the roughly 12,000 Confederate soldiers imprisoned at Elmira, around 2,900 did not survive. Neither side had a monopoly on hardship, and both camps reflected a broader collapse in prisoner exchange programs midway through the war. When those exchanges broke down, largely over disputes regarding the status of black Union soldiers captured by Confederate forces, the number of prisoners in custody soared, and the system buckled under the strain. The experience of POWs during the Korean War was set as much by ideology as by battlefield conditions. Unlike earlier wars, prisoners captured in this conflict were often viewed not just as enemy combatants, but as tools for political messaging and psychological influence. This approach defined the treatment of captured personnel on both sides, particularly by North Korean and Chinese forces. When United Nations troops, mainly American, South Korean, British, and Turkish soldiers, were taken prisoner by North Korean or Chinese forces, they often faced harsh conditions from the onset. Captives were forced to march long distances to reach holding camps, sometimes in severe weather and without adequate food or medical care. In many cases, the camps were located in remote or mountainous areas where winter temperatures dropped below freezing. One major feature of captivity under Chinese or North Korean control was political indoctrination. Prisoners were regularly required to attend re-education sessions, which included lectures, forced reading, and discussions meant to encourage criticism of their home governments. Some captives were coerced into signing statements or participating in broadcasts denouncing their countries or admitting to alleged war crimes. This practice, later described as brainwashing, became one of the defining psychological pressures faced by POWs during the war. The use of solitary confinement, group punishment, and strict control over daily routines further eroded morale. One of the most contentious issues arose after the armistice: prisoner repatriation. Unlike previous conflicts, a significant number of POWs refused to return to their home countries. Around 21 American prisoners, along with hundreds of Chinese and North Korean POWs held by the United Nations, chose not to be repatriated, many citing fear of persecution or personal belief changes as reasons. This situation complicated negotiations and highlighted how deeply some prisoners had been affected by their experience in captivity. POW captors in the Vietnam War seem to have learned a lot from the previous Korean War. The Vietnam War continued with this new kind of captivity experience for American and Allied POWs, one defined not by physical hardship, but by long-term isolation, psychological pressure, and the strategic use of prisoners as political symbols. Most of those captured were U.S. military personnel, particularly pilots shot down over North Vietnam. Once in enemy hands, they entered a system of camps that operated largely outside the scrutiny of international oversight. The most well-known facility was the Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi, nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by American captives. It housed some of the war's highest-profile prisoners, including future U.S. Senator John McCain. Prisoners generally faced extended solitary confinement, physical punishment, and highly restricted communication. Many were held in leg stocks or handcuffed for days or weeks at a time. Medical care was minimal, and injuries, especially from aircraft ejections or crashes, were often left untreated. North Vietnamese authorities made a concerted effort to extract written or recorded statements from prisoners, typically for propaganda use. This included forced confessions of war crimes, denunciations of U.S. policy, or staged interviews intended to demonstrate supposed humane treatment. Resistance to these efforts was usually met with increased pressure or more severe conditions. Another characteristic of the POW experience in Vietnam was the length of imprisonment. Some American servicemen were held for as long as 8 or 9 years. South Vietnamese soldiers captured by the North were also held under harsh conditions, often for years after the war ended. Many were not formally recognized as POWs and were placed in what were called re-education camps. There, they underwent extended periods of political indoctrination, combined with forced labor and minimal provisions. For those who survived captivity in Vietnam, the experience left lasting physical and psychological effects. Their eventual release in the early 1970s came only after years of stalled negotiations, during which their status had become a central issue in both military strategy and public opinion back home. Although often overshadowed by the world wars that followed, the Franco-Prussian War was one of the earliest modern conflicts in which the scale of prisoner capture outpaced the ability of military and civilian systems to manage it. The war was relatively short, lasting less than a year, but the collapse of the French military led to the capture of over 380,000 French soldiers by Prussian and German forces, many of whom were held in difficult conditions for months. Most of the captured French troops were taken following the decisive Battle of Sedan in September 1870, where Napoleon himself surrendered along with over 100,000 soldiers. As fighting continued and more French cities fell, additional mass surrenders occurred, swelling the prisoner population far beyond what the German Empire had anticipated or prepared for. Temporary camps were hastily established throughout Germany, particularly in places like Mainz, Kassel, and Cologne. These facilities lacked adequate shelter, sanitation, and medical infrastructure. Tents or makeshift wooden barracks housed the prisoners, but overcrowding was common. As winter set in, conditions deteriorated quickly. Many French soldiers arrived with untreated wounds or illness, and outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia spread rapidly through the camps. Estimates vary, but contemporary German records suggest that over 20,000 French POWs lost their lives in captivity, a figure attributed largely to disease and exposure rather than direct violence. While there was no Geneva Convention governing POWs at the time, both sides did attempt some exchanges and repatriations, particularly after the war ended in May 1871. However, the sheer number of prisoners and the limited transportation options meant that many French soldiers remained in camps for weeks or months after hostilities had formally ceased. The Iran-Iraq War was one of the longest, most destructive conflicts of the 20th century, and it produced tens of thousands of prisoners on both sides. Unlike earlier wars where POW treatment might be shaped by formal international agreements, this war often saw prisoners used as bargaining chips or instruments of political leverage, sometimes long after combat had ended. Over the course of the war, Iraq captured between 50,000 and 70,000 Iranian soldiers, while Iran captured around 60,000 Iraqi troops. While not every camp was abusive, many prisoners reported harsh conditions, including overcrowding, forced labor, inadequate food, and limited medical care. In some cases, prisoners were kept in underground cells or subjected to long periods of isolation. Psychological pressure was a defining feature of captivity during this conflict. Prisoners were often encouraged or coerced into participating in state-run media broadcasts, denouncing their own governments, or appearing in public ceremonies to demonstrate supposed humane treatment. Those who resisted could face stricter confinement or be transferred to more remote facilities. One of the most troubling aspects was the extended detention of POWs after the war officially ended. The conflict concluded in August 1988, but thousands of prisoners were not released until the early to mid-1990s, and some weren't repatriated until 2003. Both Iran and Iraq used the prisoners as leverage during post-war negotiations, and progress on repatriation often stalled due to broader political disputes. For many POWs, the experience meant spending up to 2 decades in captivity, sometimes without trial or regular access to humanitarian monitoring. International organizations like the Red Cross attempted to mediate, but their reach was limited. The Russian campaign of 1812 stands out as not only a military catastrophe for Napoleon's Grande Armée, but also as one of the earliest examples of large-scale prisoner loss through a combination of environmental exposure, logistical failure, and systemic neglect. During the retreat from Moscow, tens of thousands of French and Allied soldiers were captured by Russian forces under conditions that offered little chance of survival. Precise numbers are hard to confirm, but estimates suggest that over 100,000 troops from Napoleon's multinational army were taken prisoner by the Russians during and after the retreat. These included French, Polish, Italian, German, and Dutch soldiers. Most were already in poor condition, wounded, malnourished, frostbitten, before being taken into custody. The Russian winter, already responsible for massive losses among the retreating forces, compounded the dangers once soldiers became captives. Unlike later wars where POW systems had some form of centralized oversight, the early 19th century lacked formal frameworks or codified standards for prisoner treatment. Captured soldiers were marched over long distances, often barefoot and without sufficient clothing, food, or shelter. Mortality during transport was extremely high. Those who survived the marches were held in makeshift facilities or rural villages, where local resources were stretched thin. Disease was widespread. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections swept through prisoner groups, particularly during the winter months. The majority of those captured in Russia never returned home. Even after the end of hostilities, many were either too ill to travel, had lost their lives anonymously in custody, or remained unaccounted for. The fate of these prisoners was largely overlooked in contemporary accounts, but the sheer scale of abandonment makes the 1812 campaign one of the most devastating episodes for POWs in pre-modern warfare. The First World War marked a turning point in how prisoners of war were handled on an international scale. By this point, the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had established baseline expectations for POW treatment, And many belligerent states, including Britain, France, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, were nominally committed to those standards. However, in practice, the experience of captivity varied dramatically depending on location, rank, and the availability of resources. On the Western Front, POWs, particularly officers, were generally treated in accordance with international norms. Officers were usually housed separately, given more autonomy, and sometimes allowed to receive mail, books, or food parcels from home. Enlisted men typically faced harder conditions, but still had access to Red Cross support, and survival rates were relatively high. Germany, France, and Britain conducted inspections of each other's camps through neutral observers like Switzerland, and maintained POW registers. Still, overcrowding, forced labor, and poor nutrition were recurring issues, especially during the latter years of the war. Then there was the Eastern Front, where the situation was significantly worse. Russia held nearly 2 million Central Powers troops, mostly Austro-Hungarians and Germans, many of whom were sent to remote areas in Siberia and Central Asia. Harsh winters, inadequate housing, and food shortages led to widespread illness and high mortality rates. Sanitation was often poor, and medical care non-existent. Germany, in turn, held large numbers of Russian POWs, many of whom were assigned to agricultural or industrial labor. Conditions varied from tolerable to extremely harsh, depending on the camp and available supplies. Across all theaters, colonial troops and non-European soldiers often fared worse. They were sometimes segregated, given fewer rations, or denied access to the same aid as European prisoners. Racial and cultural biases shaped their treatment and visibility in the official records. Overall, World War I introduced a more structured approach to POW management, but its implementation was uneven. Geography, ideology, logistics, and race all played roles in determining whether a soldier's captivity would be bearable or deadly. Thank you for watching and making it to the end. I hope you learned something about the terrible conditions these POWs had to face. In fact, I had to take out a lot of the specific details due to YouTube's policies, but I'm sure you can imagine. If you liked the video, please give us a like and subscribe to hear about more videos like this in the future. In fact, leave a comment below about what other types of videos you'd be interested in. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again. See you next time.